When most people think of Ukraine, the Soviet Union, their minds don't usually jump straight to Ukrainian cultural revival and patriotism, considering most of Ukraine's time in the USSR was spent either on the front line, being starved, or in economic stagnation. It's almost like a tyrannical bureaucratic government with a social democratic economic system isn't exactly good at running a country. I don't know, that's just me though. But within the piles of useless steel plates produced by Soviet workers at the height of Stalin's 5-year plans, there does lie some diamonds in the rough, as with any country really. One might think of the technology found by the Soviets during the space race, the innovation in weaponry, the positive industrialization, but I prefer to think of a certain man born in a certain Soviet Socialist Republic, who, despite his flaws, seemed to actually care not just about his own country, but the entire Union. I'm of course talking about a certain Petro Shelest, straight out of Kharkiv, who was at the head of the Ukrainian SSR from 1965 until 1972, where he was unfairly ousted from power by the centralized state in Moscow. But we'll get to that later. For now, sit back, relax, grab your favorite corn dish, and enjoy. But first, if you enjoy my content and you want to see more history videos like this, subscribe, and hey, I might just keep making them. I'm trying to get 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and so yeah, I'd appreciate it. Well, let's get some background information established. Ukraine had essentially been fighting for its independence for over 900 years at this point, in the forms of various nation-states that combated enemies amongst the Rus region. Think of the Kievan Rus and successors, to the various Cossack rebellions and leaders who maintained Ukrainian independence, or at least autonomy within some regions of the country. Eventually, though, Ukraine would be split between two different empires, the Russians and the Austrians in the 1800s. This state of affairs naturally left many Ukrainians being unhappy, to say the least, during the time of imperial overlordship. Austria didn't exactly regard the local Ukrainian population with much respect, and even after the formation of Austria-Hungary, Ukrainians weren't exactly represented via its politics. Meanwhile, the Russians did what they did with every single land that they conquered, Asterix, and began intense Russification efforts of the Ukrainian people, as they had been for about 600 years before this point. However, in the 1890s, things began to change. The Ukrainian national revival in full swing, seeing Ukrainian customs, traditions, writings, hell, the language of Ukrainian being presented or used in some way, all of which strictly prohibited under Russian law at the time. All this work eventually paid off when World War I came along, and the Russian Empire, as with most things it did, started sucking harder than a hooker in Belgrade in the war effort, and essentially began collapsing. With this, the Ukrainians were able to found a state of their own for the first time in, well, a long time, the Ukrainian People's Republic. Founded upon principles of a mix of left-wing nationalism and democratic socialism, a system which could give Ukrainians their home back, and give them a home that every Ukrainian could call a home with pride. Of course, as with most examples of people wanting to make their own decisions, the right-wing communists in Moscow didn't exactly take a liking to this new government at the central rather than Kyiv. To summarize the clusterfuck that was the Ukrainian War of Independence, Ukrainian politics are just like this. Get used to it if you ever want to study it. The UPR fights hard against the Reds to be couped by the Germans, so they also get couped by the UPR again. Magna does this thing, train the perfect society, Asterix, and Ukraine is conquered by the Reds. Now, admittedly, things weren't the worst from the start, which is, the bare minimum, but according to Bolshevik sympathizers, glorified welfarist, it's important to praise lacklusterness, so I'll take on my bite. Lenin wasn't exactly a chauvinist, and the Ukrainians knew a degree of autonomy and self-reliance during his time in charge. Also during this time period, Ukrainianization. Based. The Ukrainian SSR, unlike others, had actual Ukrainians in charge of it who were picked based on skill and effectiveness. And industrialization programs also began in a way that could catch Ukraine and the Union up as a whole with the West. I'm sure that will last a long time. If you ever heard anything bad about Stalin from anybody, it's probably true. This man who knew about it just did not care. Ukraine was the land of peasant farmers. It's known as the breadbasket of Europe for a reason. People need food, Ukraine gives them food. It's a symbiotic relationship. So of course the Soviet government, after purging an uncountable amount of people inside of it, had to try something new. Instead of actually letting progress continue in Ukraine naturally, or launching a program in literally anywhere that wasn't the breadbasket of your own country, the achievement of Ukraine under the USSR would really need its own future video. But essentially, millions of Ukrainians, along with other innocents of people of various ethnic minorities within Russia, Bakshirs, Tatars, Kazakhs, many of whom were also Ukrainian, might I add, Chechens, Ingushites, Ossetians, Abkhazians, Kalmyks, and Belarusians, and a plethora of other people, suffered horrifically during the 1932 to 1935 famine, which came out as a product mostly of rapid industrialization of Ukraine dekolonization programs. These could have worked in theory, but, asking a bunch of peasants who had been tilling the land for centuries to hand over their farms they were promised to own the means of production up to the state that was breathing down their necks every damn second, didn't exactly cook up anything good, and the farmers of Ukraine and elsewhere resisted the Soviet policy, exacerbating the issue even further. It's debated whether exactly the famine was created for genocidal purposes at the start, but I personally believe that Ukraine was intentionally neglected by Soviet leadership, which ended up sparking a famine inside the territories, which the vanguard simply then weaponized against the innocents. Like, look at the track record of Serov, Beria, Yagolda, whoever else, and tell me this was a fluke. It was absolutely at the bare minimum of an act of extermination, if not a genocide, to punish the Ukrainians and their national sentiments, which in all honesty had a decent reason for existing in the first place. On to the main point, finally. This was all allowed to happen by Ukrainian leadership, and for one simple reason. Stalin, like many dictators in history, picked based on loyalty, not so much skill. Most civil leaders of the Ukrainian SSR in this time were either Russians with loyalties to Moscow, or if they were Ukrainians, one specifically loyal to Stalin, who also always had a Russian deputy with them as second in command, which was unsurprisingly essentially the same across not just all the other republics, but also present in the days of the Russian Empire. We have come full circle, with most notably a certain Lazar Kaganovich being the first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine from 1925 to 1928, and also the second secretary from 1930 to 1939. He was extremely close with Stalin and a hardline Stalinist himself, and worked to enforce the unreasonably high production quotas that the USSR demanded out of its own people. And he can be considered as one of the faces of the famine in Ukraine. Hell, you mean he also helped assert control over Turkestan? Man, this guy was fucking evil. All of this, along with many other issues in the Ukrainian SSR, culminated in the collaboration of Ukrainians with the fascists once World War II came around, resulting in some of the worst massacres of the entire war, such as the Volhynian genocide committed by the UPA against the local Polish population, along with the equally horrifying Lviv pogroms, which Ukraine still gets shit on for this day, as if it wasn't Moscow who was practically egging the Nazis to come to power on in Germany. In short, Ukraine and the Soviet Union during the Stalinist, Marxist-Leninist days weren't very good, to say the least. If anything, it was probably the worst place to live in inside the Soviet Union, because at least Kazakhstan didn't have to deal with the average Russian citizens in the Donbass region. And this isn't even mentioning the ethnic Crimean Tatar population, I would shed. We saw brutal ethnic cleansings from Pete Bear Diddy over here. So as you can imagine, the whole Ukrainian culture sitting under such intense Russification efforts was being slowly eroded by the Kremlin's rule, and things weren't exactly looking all that optimistic for the future of the Ukrainian people. But the one idiot who started this whole mess would change that by dying. It's 1953, Stalin is dead. Very exciting, I know. And here comes this new guy named Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev, one of the Soviet people that have a sense of freedom, mostly because having a government that has eyes in every house and a cult personality based on a professional corpse wasn't a very good idea. Oh wait, never mind. And so began the Soviet thaw, which saw various economic globalization programs and other political efforts. There was also a cultural reformation along with it, as you can now publish a book without having the authorities read the whole thing front to back with a microscope and kirking you for making anything they didn't like. More importantly for this story, the autonomy of the various republics also increased, and Khrushchev put an end to the various Russification efforts and deportation programs that Stalin had originally started, decentralizing many aspects of the entire Union. Although, unfortunately, these decentralization programs would come to an end after the core man was ousted about a decade later. But it had opened the floodgates for a new wave of potential, allowing a certain born Ukrainian peasant to start making his moves. In 1908, in a small village on the outskirts of Kharkiv City, was born a certain Petro Shelest. They'll either see him as a literal national Bolshevik who fought politically for Ukrainian autonomy in the USSR, or as a typical corrupt politician who only cared for himself. The truth with most things in history is a combination of the two, with a little bit of lean to the first if I'll inject my own opinion into it. Descended from a family of former Cossacks, he was a communist from very early on in life and joined the Communist Party of Ukraine in 1928 when he was about 20 years old, which he did after studying engineering in Kharkiv City itself and began working in the industrial field along with the intense industrialization programs in Ukraine at the time, mostly in Mariupol and modern-day Donetsk Oblast, even graduating in the city. But in 1936 decided to end up joining the Red Army to serve his country, but get this, was called in by the Communist Party for interior work because of how many of their members were slimed during the Great Purge, and becoming secretary just 3 years later. He put his engineering skills to good use because by the time the Germans arrived, he was managing multiple factories in both Ukraine and Russia to help out with the war effort until 1954. Even meeting Khrushchev himself, who at the time was first secretary of the Ukrainian SSR, and was pretty impressed by what Shelest managed to get done. This time in charge of multiple factories really rubbed off on Shelest, as he saw his homeland actually able to produce supplies and munitions that helped both itself and the Union, and it likely influenced a lot of his politics later down the line. Almost right after his work in the factories was completed, he was appointed for further party work, heading multiple local matters in Kyiv for city organization before being appointed second secretary of the Communist Party, and in 1963, first secretary, essentially being in charge of the entire Ukrainian SSR in a relatively short amount of time. So yeah, good for you, Petro. What you gonna do now you got Ukraine under you? Well, after signing firmly against the hardliners of the anti-party wing of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, he proclaimed loyalty to Khrushchev, before helping the plot to remove him from power just a month later. Shelest would come to deeply regret this decision. He became a member of the President, or the Politburo, and he became a notable figure in Soviet politics, being described as a national communist, who saw the importance of self-reliance in Ukraine first in the Union, which would allow the proletariat of the USSR to thrive on. For just an idea on who he was a strong supporter of the 60ers and the 1960s, a movement which advocated for diversification, more freedom in the arts and literature, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, decentralization, and the recognition of Ukraine's hardships in the Holodomor and World War II, serving as part of the anti-Stalinist left movement inside Soviet politics. It was almost like a revolution of the arts inside the so-called revolutionary nation. Although, once in power, Shelest would aid the KGB in arresting multiple members of the movement. Most of these arrests were probably done out of personal politics. Shelest was a politician in the USSR. He didn't want anyone getting any Soviet ideas after all, which remains probably the biggest target on his legacy as the leader of Ukraine. Yet he still upheld many of the ideas of the movement, aiding it when he saw fit with plans and action of promotion of the Ukrainian language. On the topic of his mistakes, however, he also supported the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, seeing the socialism with a human face that Czechs practice as being too reformist and revisionist. As far as economics goes, Shelest began further independence from Moscow inside Ukraine, and protected hundreds of Ukrainian industrial and agricultural sectors from the main powers based in the Kremlin. Most notably, in 1965, Shelest defied the foreign trade policy of the USSR, as they were selling large portions of cattle food, grain, wheat, and other crops from Ukraine without telling anybody, directly robbing Ukraine of their munitions and sending them to other republics, most notably Russia. All of this was much to Russia's annoyance. Can't have anyone actually wanting to fight for their country now, come on. But of course, as the breadbasket of the Union, Petro Shelest still worked to provide food for the whole country. Additionally, his further policies of increased Ukrainian ownership over industry in Ukraine boosted the economy quite well, actually, in stark contrast to the rest of the Union, who was in the first years of the depression and stagnation era. Shelest was also a driving force behind the urbanization of the SSR, which saw Ukrainian cities expanding whilst not driving out the rural areas of the country into irrelevancy like his predecessors had done, which also had the trickle-down effect of increasing the population of Ukraine. Furthermore, there was this one rule in the Soviet Union, well, less the Soviet Union, more so anyone that just wasn't Russia, that republics couldn't build any institutions, objects, any other works that would cost greater than 3 million Soviet rubles. This rule was set in stone. There was no changing it. So naturally, Petro went right into building the National Palace of Arts in Kyiv, effectively trolling the government, saying it was going to be for a cinema or a kino. Cerny was one of the most famous epicenters of Ukrainian culture in the city, even still maintaining national relevancy to the day. And this policy of utilizing funding to uphold the values of Ukraine and its culture continued with schools, museums, city areas, etc., all of which supported a unique blend of Ukraine's culture and socialist politics of the USSR at the time, reminding Ukrainians of what they once were. I'm not even mentioning how much the Ukrainian language rate increased in terms of statistics, and especially not mentioning the work he did for the party itself. Due to Shelest's sheer popularity, an additional 2.1 million people joined the Communist Party of Ukraine by 1971, which was twice more than the national Soviet average. All of this ended up with Ukraine being the fastest growing economy out of any republic in the USSR, becoming a shining beacon almost compared to the rest of the Union, outclassing even their so-called fraternal republics in both cultural and prosperity. The sense of independence within the USSR also further implored efforts with freedom of speech and freedom of the press, giving new thought to the Ukrainian people who'd just gotten out of the Stalinist era. Surely Ukraine was on the path to success, or maybe even one day it could lead the entire Soviet nation to prevail over its enemies. Nothing could possibly go wrong. All good things must come to an end, even if they're really damn good. Petro Shelest released his book, Oh Ukraine, Our Soviet Land, where he talked about not just modern Ukrainian politics, but also Ukrainian history of the Cossacks, particularly in the Zaporozhian Sich, who he praises their striving for independence. This would become the pretext for his downfall. If you don't know, the political elite and bureaucrats inside of Ukraine are usually divided up by region. Think of the Donbass clan who ran the country during the Yanukovych era until 2014. Brezhnev was in charge, and he himself was a part of the Dnipro clan, which opposed Shelest's Kharkiv clan. Brezhnev didn't exactly like how much freedom Shelest was getting for the Ukrainian people and decided to act now. A massive planned political mobilization was leveled against Shelest himself, claiming his new book. Let me just read this to you. It's from a note by Svetlana Kobets. Shelest's book was written in 1970 and published a large edition of 100,000 copies. A belated review of it appeared in the party periodical Communist Ukraine, Communist of Ukraine, in April 1973, a year after Shelest's fall from power. It harshly castigated the author for numerous ideological transgressions. Shelest was charged with diverging from the communist perspective in his interpretation of Ukraine's historical and cultural heritage. The reviewer noted that there was more attention paid in the book to Ukraine's pre-revolutionary past than to the revolutionary and Soviet periods in the country's history. The Cossacks, the reviewer argued, were idealized and glorified. The significance of the Treaty of Peresyov, 1654, which, according to the official interpretation, resulted in the reunification of two fraternal peoples of Russia and Ukraine, had been sorely neglected. Moreover, the role of reunification and the further evolution of Ukraine had been ignored entirely. Russia's role as Ukraine's elder brother was misinterpreted severely. The author had overlooked Russia's contribution to the aesthetic and cultural development of Ukraine. Furthermore, the author had failed to lay out proper emphasis on the overall role of the Communist Party in the life of Ukraine. The author was accused of viewing literary issues from an abstract human perspective. Finally, the book was condemned as an example of Ukrainian bourgeois nationalism, a staple accusation leveled by Soviet authorities that those rising political figures displayed a sense of national self-awareness, or voiced even mild protest against the policy of Russification. Shelest was declared guilty of this political sin for having dared to advocate for the economic self-sufficiency of Ukraine. Getting accused of such things was enough to get Shelest removed from power. Along with the political and cultural purge, and this old prick named Vladimir Sherbetsky was put in charge. I'm not going to go too deep into his ruling, but to give you an idea, he ended the Ukrainian economic miracle, carried out a brutal set of Russification policies, was a hardline Stalinist, cracked down on the most educated and artistic of Ukrainian society, and began a massive shift toward nuclear power, which isn't a bad thing on its own until you remember that the Soviets are too stupid to boil water.
Patrick, die Temperatur ist die niedrigste.
Being so unpopular, he was removed from power due to a mass protest, dying like he should have in the 1990s. Shelest himself was basically deported, becoming deputy premier in Moscow for a few years after being dismissed for health problems, and would later be stripped of that too, kicked out of the entire Communist Party. He ended up working in a factory like he had done in his youth out in Moscow, and despite continuing slander, spoke out heavily against his policies, calling him directly an autocrat, not even a communist. Oh, how I feel you, Shelest. While being the manager of an aircraft designer in Moscow, the Soviet Union had run into a round of not existing anymore, and after over the 20 years he was forced to stay in Moscow, he ended up returning to Ukraine, visiting the now independent state a various amount of times, unlike what many other nationalists sadly weren't able to do. He made a few lectures, but knew his time was running out, deciding not to return to politics, and moving back to Moscow. He died a peaceful death in Moscow on the 22nd of January, 1996. He was just 87 years old. Again, Ukraine has been thrown into a battle for her life and for her death. As of 2026, the battle is not as political as it was in the 1960s. People are dying, both innocent and deserving, and a large portion of the country has been completely destroyed. I'm not Ukrainian, as you can tell, but I stand in solidarity with the Ukrainian people, no matter what. And I want to see Ukraine's victory by any and all means necessary. Looking at the present and back into history, we've seen uncountable amount of good people who fought for Ukraine's independence one way or another. And honestly, for all his flaws, I consider Shelest to be one of them. He's like that one uncle you always knew. He was a bit of a hard ass at times and a tad racist, all admittedly. But in the end, he had values they stood up for, and he knew what was right in the end. I truly believe he wanted Ukraine and the whole USSR to succeed, unlike so many others in it. But I suppose it's up for you to decide whether that's the case or not. But even if you don't think he was all that great, which, understandable, you gotta admit the work he did for Ukraine's economy in the urban sectors was frankly impressive. And he absolutely shaped Ukraine to what it is today. That's about all it for this video. I'm happy you stopped by. Keep learning and do your research. See ya.